We have some information from NASA right now as to exactly where parts of the spacecraft fell. They were reporting it fell at 28.64 north.
When the underwater drone's camera feed flickered to life 100 feet below the Atlantic surface, the recovery team went dead silent. They had been searching for 37 days. Now they were staring at the crushed crew cabin of the Space Shuttle Challenger, still resting exactly where it had slammed into the ocean at 207 miles per hour. But that's not what made NASA physician Joseph Kerwin's blood run cold. It's what they found inside.
And please stop what you're doing. You have to listen to this story. A piece of the Challenger space shuttle has been discovered. This piece was found by divers who are working on a documentary for the History Channel.
3 of the 4 Personal Egress Air Packs had been manually activated. These devices don't turn themselves on. Someone had to reach down, locate the pack, unlock it, and deliberately start the airflow, which means the astronauts didn't die in that fireball you saw on television. They survived the breakup. The crew cabin fell for nearly 3 minutes, and at least some of them were conscious the entire way down, fully aware they were about to die. This is the story NASA didn't want you to know. The launch they should have stopped, January 28, 1986. Cape Canaveral, 36 degrees at dawn. Roger Boisjoli hadn't slept. The Morton Thiokol engineer had spent the entire night begging his bosses not to launch. He had the data. He had the photographs. He knew those rubber O-ring seals became dangerously stiff in cold temperatures. If you launch tomorrow, he told them, you're taking a risk unlike anything we've ever taken before. But here's the catch. NASA pushed back hard. The launch had been delayed 6 times already. The Teacher in Space mission was getting massive media coverage. There was pressure from Washington. And NASA managers didn't want to hear about problems. They asked Boisjoli to prove it was unsafe to launch. Not prove it was safe. Prove it was unsafe. That's a fundamental reversal of how safety decisions are supposed to work. Morton Thiokol management held a private meeting. When they came back, they had reversed their position. They recommended launch. Boisjoli refused to sign the recommendation. Another engineer put his head in his hands. But the decision was made. If you want to understand what really happened in those final minutes, hit subscribe, because what they found in that cabin changes everything. 73 seconds. The 7 crew members suited up that morning with no idea what was coming. Commander Dick Scobie, 46, Air Force veteran, second shuttle flight. The kind of pilot who stayed calm when everything went wrong. His wife June and 2 kids were watching from the VIP area. Pilot Michael Smith, 40, Navy aviator, first space mission. He'd waited years for this moment. His family had flown in from North Carolina to watch him finally reach space. Judith Resnick, 36, electrical engineer, one of America's first female astronauts, brilliant, driven, on her second flight. Her father was in the crowd. Ellison Onizuka, 39, first Asian American in space, Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. His daughters had made him a good luck charm to carry on the mission. Ronald McNair, 35, physicist and saxophonist, second African American in space. He'd planned to record the first saxophone solo ever performed in orbit. Gregory Jarvis, 41, engineer, first flight. He'd been bumped from 2 previous missions. This was finally his turn. Ann Krista McAuliffe, 37, high school teacher from New Hampshire, selected from 11,000 applicants to be the first civilian in space. Her students were watching from their classroom. Her parents were at the Cape. The whole country knew her name. These weren't just astronauts. These were people with kids waiting at home, spouses who'd kissed them goodbye that morning, parents who'd driven hours to watch their children reach for the stars. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off from pad 39B. The massive solid rocket boosters ignited, 4.5 million pounds of thrust pushing the shuttle stack into the sky. The ascent looked perfect. Families cheered. Students across America watched on classroom televisions. Teachers pointed at screens. This was supposed to be the mission that made space feel accessible to everyone. At 35 seconds, Challenger passed through max Q, the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure. At 52 seconds, the main engines throttled back up. At 68 seconds, Mission Control radioed, "Challenger, go at throttle up." Commander Scobie replied, "Roger, go at throttle up." Those were the last words from the shuttle. At 73 seconds, pilot Michael Smith said something. Some analysts believe it was "oh." Others aren't sure. But whatever he said, he saw something wrong, something on his instruments, something outside his window, something that made a veteran Navy pilot react in the final second of his life. 1 second later, at 48,000 feet traveling at twice the speed of sound, the shuttle broke apart. But get this, what you saw on television wasn't what actually happened. That massive fireball everyone remembers, that was the external fuel tank rupturing. Thousands of gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen igniting in the atmosphere. The media called it an explosion. It wasn't. Not technically. The crew cabin? It didn't explode. It separated from the shuttle largely intact. And it kept flying. The fall. Now, here's where it gets disturbing. For 25 more seconds after the breakup, the crew cabin continued upward on its own momentum. It reached 65,000 feet, nearly 12.5 miles above the Earth. Then physics took over, and it started to fall. No parachutes, no escape rockets, no recovery system. The cabin was never designed to survive separation from the shuttle. It was just the pressurized box where the crew sat. Now, it was a coffin tumbling through the sky. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. That's how long they fell. Count it out. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Keep counting. You'll be counting for a very long time. During that descent, the astronauts would have experienced weightlessness, the same floating sensation they'd trained for, the same feeling they'd dreamed about since childhood. Except this time, they were falling to their deaths. At 9 a.m., still falling. At 9:01, still falling. At 9:02, still falling. Then the cabin hit the Atlantic Ocean at 207 miles per hour. At that speed, water is as hard as concrete. But finding the wreckage was the easy part. What they pulled from that cabin would haunt NASA for decades. 37 days of searching. The search operation was the largest in NASA history. Coast Guard helicopters crisscrossed the Atlantic. Navy vessels formed grid patterns across hundreds of square miles. Specialized diving ships deployed sonar equipment that could detect objects buried in the seafloor. Recovery teams worked around the clock in shifts. Every day for 5 weeks, teams searched for the crew cabin. They found pieces of the shuttle everywhere, engine components scattered across the ocean floor, heat shield tiles, wiring harnesses, sections of the wing, pieces of the external tank. One day they'd recover a chunk of fuselage. The next day, a piece of the payload bay doors. But not the cabin, not the reinforced compartment where 7 astronauts had been strapped into their seats. Not the part that mattered most. Basically, the cabin could have landed anywhere in a debris field that stretched for miles. Ocean currents had been moving wreckage since the moment it hit the water. The seafloor in that area wasn't flat. There were ridges, depressions, places where a large object could settle and become partially buried in sediment. The families waited. The nation waited. NASA knew they couldn't stop searching. Then on March 7, 1986, 37 days after the disaster, a sonar operator noticed something. A large return signal, 18 miles northeast of the launch site, approximately 100 feet down. The coordinates were logged. The dive team prepared. The underwater drone descended. And that's when everything changed. The cabin was crushed from impact but recognizable. The forward section was compressed. The roof structure had collapsed, but you could still see it was the crew compartment. The seats were still attached to what remained of the floor. Flight manuals and checklists floated in the current, pages drifting in the underwater darkness. Personal items were scattered among the wreckage, and inside, the remains of all 7 astronauts, still strapped in, still wearing their helmets and partial pressure suits, exactly where they'd been during launch. The divers who first reached the site later said it was the most haunting thing they'd ever seen. This wasn't debris. This was a tomb. So here's the deal. Recovering the remains was devastating enough. The operation took days. Every movement was careful, deliberate, respectful. A secure perimeter was established. Press helicopters were kept miles away. Only authorized personnel were allowed anywhere near the site. But what investigators found when they examined the equipment, that's what kept NASA officials awake at night. The horrifying discovery. NASA physician Joseph Kerwin led the medical analysis. He'd seen a lot in his career. but nothing prepared him for what the evidence revealed. 3 of the 4 personal egress air packs had been activated. Basically, these were emergency air supplies, small portable devices that could provide several minutes of breathable oxygen. Each astronaut had one beneath their seat. Here's the catch. These devices don't activate automatically. There's no sensor, no trigger. Someone has to manually reach down, locate the pack, unlock the restraint, pull it up, and start the airflow. That's not a reflex. That's a deliberate, trained response to an emergency. Pilot Michael Smith's air pack activated. There were also indications he may have tried to restore electrical power to the cabin. Judith Resnick's pack activated. Ellison Onizuka's pack activated, possibly by Resnick, who was positioned where she could reach it. 3 astronauts, fighting to survive, taking purposeful action, even as their cabin plummeted toward the ocean. And that's putting it lightly, because the implications are almost too terrible to process. Were they conscious? At 48,000 feet, there's almost no atmospheric pressure. The air is so thin that without supplemental oxygen, you lose consciousness in 15 to 20 seconds. Your brain simply can't function without adequate oxygen. But those air packs, they provided breathable oxygen, several minutes worth. And the cabin may have retained some pressure after the breakup. The structure was damaged but not completely shattered. As the cabin fell into denser atmosphere, the air pressure inside would have increased naturally, which means at least some of the crew members may have been conscious for part of that fall. Maybe most of it, maybe all of it. Now, here's where it gets disturbing on a level most people can't handle. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Think about what that means. Really think about it. Falling through the sky at terminal velocity. The cabin spinning, tumbling, the view through the windows alternating between blue sky and dark ocean getting closer. Knowing with absolute certainty that you are going to die. Looking at your crewmates, Commander Scobie in the left seat, Smith in the right, seeing their faces. Understanding there's nothing anyone can do. Thinking about your family, your children who are watching on television right now, who don't know yet, who are probably still cheering. Your spouse who kissed you goodbye this morning. Your parents who flew across the country to watch you reach space. 2 minutes and 45 seconds of knowing exactly how this ends. Of experiencing the terror of that helpless descent. Of having time to understand that you'll never see any of them again. That's not a quick death. That's an eternity. Dr. Kerwin's official report was carefully worded. He stated that the crew, possibly but not certainly, lost consciousness due to the loss of cabin pressure. He could not determine when or whether consciousness was lost. The medical evidence was inconclusive on that specific point. But get this, the activated air packs tell their own story. Someone was alive down there. Someone was thinking clearly enough to remember their training. Someone was fighting to survive even when survival was impossible. Pilot Michael Smith, specifically, appears to have taken multiple deliberate actions. His PEAP was activated. His oxygen supply was turned on. There are indications he may have attempted to restore electrical power to the cabin. This was a veteran Navy aviator doing everything in his power to save his crew, even in those final moments. NASA kept the detailed findings classified. They told the families privately. The agency decided the specifics would only cause more pain. And maybe they were right, but the truth eventually emerged. Documents released through FOIA requests, former officials speaking on background, journalists who wouldn't let the story die, the story that NASA tried to protect the world from. Now you know what they found. Why it happened. The investigation that followed was the most comprehensive in NASA history. President Reagan appointed a commission led by former Secretary of State William Rogers. The commission included astronauts, engineers, aviation experts, and one Nobel Prize-winning physicist named Richard Feynman. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, reviewed thousands of documents, examined every piece of recovered debris, held public hearings where NASA officials squirmed under questioning. But the most dramatic moment came from Feynman. During a televised hearing, while NASA administrators were giving technical explanations full of jargon, Feynman did something beautifully simple. He took a piece of O-ring rubber, the same material used in the booster seals, dropped it into a glass of ice water, and compressed it with a small clamp. When he removed the clamp, the rubber didn't spring back. The cold had made it lose its resilience, its flexibility, its ability to seal. I believe that has some significance for our problem, Feynman said quietly. Simple, devastating, undeniable. In one demonstration, he had shown what engineers at Morton Thiokol had been trying to explain for months. Cold temperatures made the O-rings dangerous, and NASA had launched anyway. The technical cause was straightforward. A rubber O-ring in the right solid rocket booster failed to seal because of the cold. Hot combustion gases, over 5,000 degrees, escaped through the joint. Those gases burned through the external fuel tank like a blowtorch. The tank ruptured. The shuttle broke apart. But here's the catch. Engineers had warned about this exact failure mode. For years, they had data showing O-ring erosion on previous flights. They had photographs. They had begged not to launch on January 28th. They had been overruled by managers who didn't want schedule delays. The Rogers Commission was brutal in its findings. They blamed the O-ring failure, yes, but they placed equal blame on NASA's organizational culture. The agency had normalized deviance. Small problems that should have been red flags became acceptable risks because nothing catastrophic had happened yet. They had let schedule pressure override engineering judgment. They had stopped listening to the people who knew the hardware best. 7 people died because managers didn't want to hear bad news. So here's the deal. The lesson should have been permanent, but institutional memory fades. The aftermath. After identification was complete, the remains were released to the families for private burial. In 1986, DNA analysis wasn't what it is today. Identification relied on dental records, physical examination, and personal effects found with the remains. It took weeks. The families waited in agony. Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, and Gregory Jarvis were buried at Arlington National. Cemetery with full military honors, rows of white headstones, folded flags, the weight of a grateful nation. Ellison Onizuka was cremated. His ashes rest at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii, overlooking Pearl Harbor, his home state honoring its first astronaut. Ronald McNair was buried in Rest Lawn Memorial Park in South Carolina. His hometown of Lake City later named schools and scholarship programs in his honor. Krista McAuliffe was buried in Calvary Cemetery in her home state of New Hampshire. The teacher who was supposed to inspire a generation, the first civilian selected for spaceflight, the woman whose students had watched her die on live television, and the crew cabin itself. After examination was complete, NASA made a decision in consultation with the families. They buried it at sea in a classified location somewhere in the Atlantic. They worried that if the coordinates became known, divers and souvenir hunters would violate the site. Trophy. Seekers, ghouls, people who would treat a tomb like an attraction. The exact location remains classified to this day. The crew cabin of Space Shuttle Challenger rests somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, undisturbed, as it should be. The rest of the Challenger debris, the pieces recovered from the ocean floor over months of searching, sits in decommissioned missile silos at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Abandoned Minuteman silos now serve as storage for the remains of a spacecraft that was supposed to carry humans to the stars. No public access, no tours, no visitors, probably forever. But what mattered most wasn't where the remains ended up. It was what NASA learned from them. The legacy. Because of what that underwater drone discovered, NASA changed everything. The shuttle program was grounded for 32 months. The solid rocket boosters were completely redesigned. Management structures were overhauled. New safety positions were created. Engineers were encouraged to speak up without fear of being overruled. Now here's where it gets disturbing all over again. In 2003, NASA experienced another tragedy. Columbia broke apart during re-entry. 7 more astronauts died. The investigation revealed that some of the institutional problems from Challenger had crept back. The lessons had been learned and then partially forgotten. But the core truth from January 28, 1986 remains. Listen to your engineers, respect the risks. Remember that behind every mission are real people with families who deserve to have them come home. The activated air packs in that cabin changed how NASA thinks about crew survival. Future spacecraft incorporated better escape systems, better survival equipment, better emergency protocols. Astronauts who flew after Challenger survived situations that might have killed them because NASA learned from what that underwater drone revealed. When the recovery team watched that drone footage from 100 feet below the Atlantic, they found more than wreckage. They found evidence of courage, 3 air packs manually activated, crew members fighting to survive even when survival was impossible. And they found a warning, written in crushed metal and human remains, a warning that has saved lives ever since. The Challenger crew's final gift to the space program was the truth about how they died. That truth was horrifying, but it changed everything. Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe. They fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Some of them may have been conscious the entire way down. And in those final moments, they did exactly what they were trained to do. They fought. That's the story NASA kept quiet for years. Now you know. So here's the question that still divides NASA engineers. If the shuttle had been equipped with better escape systems, could any of them have survived that fall? Let me know in the comments. If this story hit you as hard as it hit me,